Welcome to the inaugural edition of Well Read Magazine's podcast, Inside Voice. I'm your host, Robert Gwaltney. It's my pleasure today to enter into conversation with my guest, Jeffrey Dale Lofton, author of the novel CLAY SUZIE. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you for having me, Robert. And well,
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
So a little bit about you for our listeners before we get started. Jeffrey Dale Lofton hails from Warm Springs, Georgia, best known for Roosevelt's Little White House. He calls the nation's capital home now, where early on he spent many a night acting on the stages of DC's theaters and performing arts centers. He even scored a few television appearances, including a Super Bowl halftime commercial, which his accountant wisecracked is the finest work of your career. When he stepped away from acting for other more traditional employment, much to his parents' delight and relief, he also focused on pursuing postgraduate work, ultimately being awarded master's degrees in both public administration and library and information science. Today, he is a senior advisor at the Library of Congress, surrounded by books and people who love books. In short, paradise. Jeffrey, before your book, CLAY SUZIE, I think January 10th was the launch date.
It was, yeah.
Before it even came out into the world, it was awarded the Seven Hills Literary Prize for Fiction. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And it was named a Lambda Literary Most Anticipated Book. People have been saying lovely things about your debut novel, one of them being Christopher Castellani, author of Leading Men, and this is what he has to say. You can't help but root for Philbet, the unforgettable hero of Jeffrey Dale Lofton's arresting debut, CLAY SUZIE. I was moved by the insights and settings of this book and by the vivid depiction of a unique childhood that feels universal in its longing. Can't get much better than that.
Don't get much better than that.
Christopher Castellani, how wonderful. So congratulations. So many people have said so many wonderful things, and I've had the opportunity to read your book in advance, and I thought it was just lovely.
Thank you. That means a lot. Thank you.
So just underneath the title, CLAY SUZIE, one will see a novel inspired by true events. Is this book a thinly disguised memoir of growing up gay in the Deep South, Jeffrey?
Yeah, it is. To use a literary term, it's a fictionalized memoir. And it, like Philbet, the protagonist, I was born, as you mentioned, in Warm Springs with a skeletal deformity of the chest. And, it was difficult under the best of circumstances. Like Philbet's family, mine was just not equipped to guide and to help shape the path of a child like me. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't willful neglect. It was parenting through equal parts love and also ignorance and fear. And I always felt as though I was on the fringes looking in on this world that just didn't seem to square with what I felt inside myself, deep down inside of my heart. And so I think here's an example of inspired by true events, not to give too much away, but just like Philbet's daddy, my own was shot in the head while trying to break up a domestic dispute at the filling station convenience store that sat across the road from our house. And this place was the social center of our community. In the book, I call it the Times Square of our small community. And, I changed the details of that horrific event. But, the core event is true. And that's why I think of CLAY SUZIE as based in fact, but not bound by fact.
Understood. So about a month or so ago, I received a lovely package. And in that package was a copy of CLAY SUZIE. And accompanying that was this wonderful Matchbox car.
Yeah.
Philbet, the character, the protagonist in your book, is obsessed with cars. Is this something that you share with Philbet? Talk a little bit about that love of cars.
Yes, I have always loved cars. In fact, I have the one that started it all right here. This is a 1968 Mercury Cougar, my favorite of all times, and the doors open. And when I was a child, I imagined that these doors were wings, and this little car and I flew to so many places that existed only up here in my noggin, in my imagination. And to this day, I can still, with just the slightest glimpse of a car, the curve of a fender, part of a taillight, I can tell you the year, make, and model of that car.
That's remarkable.
And my partner, who has absolutely no interest in moving vehicles of any kind, says that I am a car savant. And I think that if we look at it clinically, I am.
That would be accurate. How many Matchbox cars would you say that you amassed over the time of your childhood?
As many as they made. I had several. So there were these little suitcases. They looked like little plastic suitcases, and they were trays. There were, I think, 4 trays in them, and they were all just jam-packed. So I would say well over 100, probably upwards of 200. Whatever there was to have, I had them, and maybe more than one if I could get my hands on it.
So do you still have them today?
I do.
You do.
I do. And this one doesn't live in the case anymore. It's been freed. It lives outside with me and sits here at my desk, and I look at it all the time. And, if I need inspiration or, to be taken back, I just pick it up and we go back.
It's a bit of like a time machine, right? From Back to the Future. Sort of helps get you back to that place.
It is that, and I love music from that era as well. And I'll turn the music on, and just listening to that music sort of transports me back to those times and reminds me of events, people that I've not forgotten but haven't thought about in a while. It's a really wonderful way to transport oneself back. I think that most writers have something that reminds them, stirs imagination, and transports them back that way.
Agreed. Music is so evocative. There are those songs sometimes that will just bring back memories and will almost take you to your knees. Is there a specific song that has that power over you?
Well, I always loved Puff the Magic Dragon as a child, and my cousins who lived across the road after we moved, I was probably 5 or 6 at this point, they had a record player, of course, that and Puff the Magic Dragon, they had the big holes in the very center of the smaller records, and they had this little clip that would place in it, would fit on the larger record player, and they always played Puff the Magic Dragon for me. So that's one that always sort of transcends, transports me back.
So you talked a little bit about the car and music and how that can really sort of take you back. So stepping back sometime to the beginning, to the genesis of Red Clay Suzie, talk a little bit about the birth of this novel and how it came to be.
Well, I actually started writing Red Clay Suzie just after I left home in the mid-1980s to go to LaGrange College, which is a small liberal arts institution in LaGrange, Georgia. And it's not that far away from where I grew up. It's only 30, 35 miles or so. But the best thing about LaGrange College in LaGrange, Georgia, when I was a teenager, was that they were not where I grew up. They were away. And as soon as I left home, as soon as I arrived at college, it was such an otherworldly experience. There was humiliation and frustration and anger and confusion, and all of it pent up over years. It needed an outlet, and it sort of burst forth. So I actually started writing. I call it an exorcism by exposition. That's what I've come to think about it. And so I started writing, and it's because living at home had this effect of just pushing all of that down. So I never dealt with this complex, I call it the complex fabric of my boyhood. But when I left home, it was like a dam broke, and these memories, these vivid, white-hot memories of my childhood among my family members and childhood and teenage friends, just burst forth, and writing was a salve. It was so healing. And but college got in the way, really busy, schoolwork. Plus, I was always so, I was just preoccupied with hiding myself, my physical self, under shirts and sweaters. And that is not easy to do in hot Georgia, hot as blazes, Georgia. You live there. And so I put the journals away that I was writing, having every intention of going back to them once I got my college sea legs under me. But I didn't go back to them for decades. And so this is what happened. Fast forward to Washington, D.C., where I now live. And I read in succession, Call Me by Your Name. And then I reread To Kill a Mockingbird, one of my all-time favorite books. And there was something about those two books, one after the other. I think of it as the power of literature. It just broke me open. It cracked me open. And all of these memories started coming back. And I remembered those journals, and I went back to them, and I started rereading them. And then I began to write again on my mobile phone, typing away on my mobile phone on the train, going to and from my job at the Library of Congress during my commute. And I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell anybody until I had a full first draft. And then over breakfast one morning, I told my partner that I was very hesitant. I said, I wrote a novel. And he almost choked on his coffee in disbelief. And I'll always treasure that image of him. So that's how I wrote it.
I think it's wise not to let others know that you're writing a book, because then you're able to do it in some level of privacy. Otherwise, there are always those questions. Well, how's it coming? Yeah. When are you going to be done? What's next? So I admire that you took that.
Well, how do you handle that once you've written a book and they know that you're writing another one? What do you do then?
Exactly. Well, yeah, then you're never off the hook. You're never off the hook. They're always going to want to know what you're doing next, of course. Yeah. The author's note in the book addresses bullying and body shaming, and you talked about your own personal journey with physical challenges. How is Red Clay Suzie a message of hope to young adults who feel marginalized?
Well, I think of Red Clay Suzie as a message of hard-fought self-acceptance achieved over a childhood of bullying, intentional and unintentional bullying, and body blow rejection. But I didn't always think of it that way. Not at first, anyway. There weren't books like Red Clay Suzie when I was growing up. At least they weren't on the bookmobile that I'd love to visit and magically appeared at the filling station across the road from our house every week. But, as I mentioned, I typed on my iPhone and to and from work on the train, and I'd get off at my stop and go to my car for the short drive home, and I'd just get behind the wheel and I would just burst out into tears. And it was somewhere around a little over halfway writing the first draft that I thought maybe this could be a roadmap for young people who I call them, I think of them as my fellow fringies, people who have lived on the fringes, on the outside looking in, feeling as though they don't belong and wondering where the place in the world is that will welcome them. And so it was about that point that I thought maybe this could be something for them to help them navigate terrain that I had already navigated. And a comment, there's one comment that probably says it better than I do, and that's from Pete Cross, who is a very talented voice actor, and he narrated the audio version of Red Clay Suzie. And after he recorded it, he and I chatted a couple of times, and he said, it's such a tender story. I wish that I'd had this book when I grew up. It would have made all the difference. And I think that's the highest praise, in addition to Christopher Castellani, that I could ever receive.
Right. I agree. I think that if I'd had this book growing up in South Georgia, I wouldn't have felt quite so lonesome. It's nice to know that there are other Red Clay Suzies out there in the world.
Yeah, and if we could only find other little red clay Suzies to, to be friends with when we're younger. So often from small towns, we believe that there's nobody else in the world like us. We don't know that maybe just the street over, in the house next to us, there's someone who might welcome us and offer a measure of comfort just from their friendship. But books can help us do that when there is no one else.
You and I are both around the same age. We're boys of the 70s and teenagers, young adults in the 80s. And growing up in where I grew up in Cairo, Georgia, we did, all of the individuals who were known or suspected to be gay, really in a way, were cautionary tales. They did very much live on the fringe. So there were really no positive role models to support having a positive outlook for your future.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I'm happy to see that it's shifted over time.
Yeah.
That there are young people today who do have an opportunity to bear witness to positive examples of living and being a productive member of the LGBTQ community. You talked a little bit about how emotional this was for you to write, and that at the end of a writing session that you would be tearful. And there is such an honesty within this novel and many heartbreaking moments. What would you say gave you the courage to write such a deeply personal and revealing novel?
Well, I actually don't think that it took courage to write it. I think that writing it has made me courageous, because I didn't initially write it for anybody but myself. It was an outpouring of what was inside me to heal. And it was like cathartic healing. It was exorcism by exposition, as I mentioned. And so it was only for myself. At some point, I thought maybe I should try to share this to see if it might help somebody else. And so I found first readers, people I trusted, to give feedback. And that was one step towards sharing it with the world. And then I got a literary agent. And that's definitely a step towards sharing it with a larger audience, because that's a literary agent's purpose, is to find a publisher to publish the book. And then when I signed the publishing deal, I knew there was no turning back. You can't get out of those. No. I knew that somebody eventually. Not easily.
Not easily.
And so what I found, I liken it to coming out to my parents as gay over 30 years ago, because when I did that, I was in tears and I was ashamed, and my parents were ashamed of me. But this has been, writing Red Clay Suzie has been a kind of coming out as a whole person, because there's nothing to hide. All of me is in the book. Philbet's story is my story. And I'm not crying and I'm not ashamed. And my parents and I have been through, my family and I have been through so much in the last 30 years. They've come to accept me and love me, and they're not ashamed either. And that whole process has given me courage.
What's the reaction? What has the reaction been of your family toward Red Clay Suzie?
Well, they've actually turned it into a parlor game of sorts. They have put down the names of main characters in the book and cameo appearance characters in the book on a sheet of paper. And I was back in Georgia recently, and they put this piece of paper in front of me, and they've listed these fictional characters and real people out to the side, people that they believe inspired the fictional characters. Did I get it right? Did I get it right? And in some cases, the fictional characters who have no counterpart in real life, they've assigned a real person to, and I won't answer. I say, well, I can't say.
I love that.
It's a work of fiction, which it is. It's a work of fiction. But that's been the most recent reaction. But on a more serious note, I've gotten a lot of calls and text from family members and friends who said, we had no idea that it was so difficult growing up. We just didn't understand. We're sorry we didn't pay attention more. And that's been lovely to have that support. And but I think the funniest reaction of all was early on, before anyone read it. I traveled to Georgia, my parents' Georgia home, to talk with them. It was for a visit, and I mentioned to my father, and he was in his recliner watching the television, and next to his recliner is a post, and he's usually got his hand stuck on that post, sort of propped up there. And I said, Daddy, which is what I call him, I have some news. Yeah. And he was looking at the television the entire time. I said, I wrote a novel. And he never looked at me. He said, you wrote a what? A novel. Is it a hardback? I'm very excited about being a hardback.
The important questions. You talked earlier about Pete Cross having narrated the audiobook, and I've had an opportunity to listen to some of that. He did an astounding job, but you also do a lovely job reading your own work. Would you mind sharing a brief excerpt with us?
I would love to. Thank you. I just happen to have a copy right here. I'll give it a little context to set it up. So I think we've established Philbet is born with a physical deformity of the chest, and this makes the act of taking his shirt off in public just unthinkable. In this passage, Philbet longs for an older boy named Knox, and this is a boy he idolizes, and Philbet overcomes his fear of taking off his shirt, which he typically hides under shirts that his mother makes for him on her Singer sewing machine. And one important point, Knox has a nickname for Philbet, and that is Keebler. Let's go swimming, Knox said. Now, swimming was a shirts off activity, and so I avoided that at all cost. So I said, I don't swim. Oh, I'll teach you, he offered. That's okay. Everybody needs to know how to swim. Oh, I know how, I just don't. Why not? He asked. Water gets in my ears. Earplugs. They don't really work, I countered. Oh, come on, Keebler, it's so hot. Well, okay, you don't have to go in, but you're coming along. Let's go. And with that, he pulled me to the door by the hand, and then he guided me towards the woods with his hand on the small of my back. I followed him down a steep but not deep gully and into a mostly dried up creek bed. And then we turned and we were in the open, the sun suddenly making us squint after having been in the cool shade of the piney woods. And a beautiful dark green lake spread out on the wood with the woods on all sides. And he sat down on the bank and then he started to pull his shoes off. Let's go in. No, I said way too abruptly. Well, you don't have to put your head under. No. Well, okay, he said. Before I lost my courage, I admitted, I don't want to take my shirt off, thinking the only thing worse than telling him about my deformity was to leave him thinking I was a total weirdo. Oh, it's just, I never done that. It's because it's okay, Keebler, it's no problem. But then, before I could talk myself out of it, I took my shirt off, my chest fully exposed in the sunlight, and I just stood. See? He didn't talk, he just stared. My teenage fantasy was looking at what I spent hour after hour trying to hide. Say something, I thought. Does it hurt? Only when you don't touch it, I said without thinking. What? Nothing. Never. Just forget it. I never felt so exposed than I did right then. My shirt off with my white, pasty, skinny, malformed bird chest in full view of the boy I loved. And I didn't even know if he liked boys, much less freaky me. And the sun hurt so much because I couldn't hide. And the cavity in my chest is already a smaller space than my heart needed to function. It just felt more compressed and restricted than usual. But I cherished this moment as much as I hated it. I mean, it hurt so much. Both the blood pumping heart in my chest and my feeling heart, the one that I wanted to give to him. Was I going to die right here in front of him? But if I didn't take this chance now, I never would. And if he didn't reject me after seeing my half-sunken chest, then I could trust him. I could believe anything that happened after that. He just stared at me, but I couldn't look back. But as embarrassing as it was, pain was not because I was disfigured and all my organs were fighting for room. I ate because someone finally saw me.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
You can certainly sense the inspiration of the coming of age of To Kill a Mockingbird, and then just that longing of, call me by your name.
I think that it is sort of the love child of those two books.
Absolutely. What I find also remarkable and commendable is that you are donating a portion of your proceeds from CLAY SUZIE to two organizations that help at-risk youth. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I've always been such a fan, admired the work of two organizations, the work they do every day to help at-risk youth. The Born This Way Foundation, which was founded by Lady Gaga and her mother, Cynthia Germanata, help at-risk youth live their best lives, their richest lives. And the Trevor Project, which has a suicide prevention hotline for LGBTQ youth. And I decided that I wanted to support them in some way. And so I've decided to donate a portion of the proceeds to them.
Lovely. So at this very moment, there are young people out there who are struggling. There might be some young people who happen upon this podcast and video. For those that are struggling for whatever reason, living life as outsiders, what message would you like to leave them?
I would tell them that bullies are no more than paper predators. They have no more power over you than you yourself give them. And they're as afraid of life as you are, maybe more so. I tell them that their bodies, whatever imperfections, perceived or real, your body has, it's beautiful. And treat it with as much kindness and care as you possibly can, so that it will take you as far and as long as it is able. And I would tell them that is the quality of their hearts and minds that matter most. But most of all, I would tell them that love is never wrong. True love is never wrong. And you should bravely bestow it on whomever is worthy of that gift. That's what I wish I had known when I was a child, when I was growing up, when I was young. And if I could go back miraculously and whisper that into the ear of my younger self, that's what I would say.
I love that. One more question, Jeffrey. What has your novel, CLAY SUZIE, taught you?
It's taught me that you don't have to be perfect to be happy.
Beautiful and succinct. Jeffrey Dale Lofton, thank you for joining me today and sharing your inside voice.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you to Well-Read Magazine and Inside Voices and Mandy Haynes. And it's a wonderful to be here with you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It was wonderful. And gentle listeners, until next time, I'm Robert Gwaltney.